The room hums with fluorescent light. There's a camera mounted in the corner, its red eye unblinking. They don't need to tell me it's recording. I can feel its presence like a weight pressing down, waiting to capture every word I'm about to say. The room is cold, sterile. They always keep it like this, as if a little chill in the air could somehow make a man repent faster. I've been sitting here for hours, waiting for the recording equipment to start, the pens to come out, the promises of leniency they'll dangle like carrots. None of that matters to me. I didn't come here to bargain. The detective walks in, dragging the scent of stale coffee and impatience with him, a stocky man with tired eyes that have seen far too much. He doesn't even sit yet, just stands by the door watching me like I might lunge at him. Smart man. If I were anyone else in this prison, he might have been right. But I'm not here to harm him. Not yet, anyway. You called me down here for this, he says, pulling out a chair and dropping a thick manila folder on the table between us. My name is scrawled across the front. It feels so impersonal, just another name in a list of sinners. But I'm not like the others. He doesn't open it. He doesn't need to. I know exactly what's inside. You've got a lot of explaining to do, he says. His voice is a low growl, practiced, the kind of tone that makes weaker men crumble. I just smile. I plan to explain everything, I say. He pauses, perhaps caught off guard by my calm. Finally, he sits and leans back, crossing his arms. I'm not interested in stories, just the facts. You want to confess to the murders of Michael Trent, Rebecca Grayson, and Derek Holder? That's correct, I reply. You realize the charges against you are already damning without a confession, right? They found your fingerprints, the weapon, everything. So why this now? I lean forward, the cuffs around my wrists clinking softly against the metal table. Because there's a bigger story you need to hear, and if you're going to try me for murder, you should at least understand why I did it. He leans back, skeptical. Enlighten me. I take a deep breath and begin. It started with Michael Trent. I didn't know him at first, not really. He was just another suit in the crowd, sharp, charming, one of those guys who looks like he belongs on magazine covers. But there was something about him, something wrong. You ever look at someone and feel the hair on the back of your neck stand up, like every instinct in your body is screaming that they're dangerous? The detective doesn't answer, but I see his jaw tighten. I started watching him. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. He was a lawyer, one of those defense types who gets the worst people out of the worst crimes. Maybe I was just looking for someone to hate. But then I started noticing patterns. He spent a lot of time in places no lawyer had business being, playgrounds, community centers, the kind of places where kids gather. My voice tightens, the memory clawing its way to the surface. He was careful, though. Never lingered too long, never drew attention, but I followed him. I started to see the cracks in the mask. At night, he'd go home to this big house in the suburbs, lights off, curtains drawn, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him, so I broke in. The detective's chair creaks as he shifts. You broke into his house? I had to know, I say, my voice rising slightly before I catch myself. And what I found, it was worse than I could have imagined. What did you find? The detective asks, his tone sharper now. Photos of children, explicit photos, documents detailing payments, names and dates. He was part of something bigger, something vile, and then there was the smell. Smell? I nod, remembering it vividly. Sulphur. Like a match struck and left to burn, it clung to everything he touched, and it was coming from the basement. I shake my head, trying to keep the memory at bay. God, it was like stepping into another world. Symbols I didn't recognize covered the walls, painted in black sludge that stank like decay. They felt ancient, wrong, the kind of thing you don't forget once you've seen it. And in the center of the room there was a table, shackles, bloodstains that hadn't been cleaned properly. The detective's pen starts moving again, scratching across the paper. And this is when you decided to kill him? No, I say firmly. Not yet. I still thought he was just a monster in the human sense of the word, a predator. It wasn't until I confronted him that I realized the truth. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. It was late. His office was empty, his secretary gone home for the night. I waited for him in the dark. When he walked in, he didn't even look surprised to see me. It was like he'd been expecting it. What did you say to him? I asked him why. Why the photos, why the files, why the children, and you know what he did? The detective shakes his head and I lean closer, my voice barely above a whisper. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a fake one, a deep guttural sound that made my skin crawl. And then his face changed. Changed how? His eyes turned black, not dark, black, like the pupils swallowed everything. His skin turned ashen and his mouth... I shake my head. It wasn't a mouth anymore, it was rows of jagged shards like a shark's. And when he opened his mouth, I swear to God I could hear voices screaming. That's when I knew I wasn't just dealing with some sick predator. He was something else, something worse. The detective's pen stops mid-sentence. He doesn't look up, but his grip tightens. I grabbed the letter opener from his desk when he lunged at me. He was fast, inhumanly fast. I stabbed him in the chest and he screamed. Not like a man in pain. It was this guttural, ear-piercing sound that made the walls shake. And then he burned. His whole body turned to ash right there in front of me. The detective finally looks up, his face unreadable. You expect me to believe that? I smile again, wider this time. That's what I thought you'd say. But you'll believe me soon enough, especially when I tell you about Rebecca and Derek. Their stories are worse, much worse. The detective doesn't say anything at first. His lips press into a thin line as he studies me, looking for the cracks, the tells, the signs of a liar. I let him look. Let him think whatever he needs to think. Rebecca Grayson, he says finally, breaking the silence. You admit to killing her too? Yes, I say without hesitation. And let me guess, he says, leaning forward, she wasn't human either? I nod, ignoring the disdain in his voice. Not in the way you'd understand. Rebecca Grayson was something far worse. The detective crosses his arms. All right, let's hear it. Rebecca worked as a nurse, I begin, at St. Mary's General. She was good at her job, or at least that's what everyone thought. Always smiling, always going the extra mile for her patients. She even volunteered at a hospice on her days off. People loved her, admired her, trusted her. But I didn't. From the moment I met her, I felt it again. That same crawling sensation under my skin, like my body was trying to warn me before my mind caught up. I'd gone to the hospital to visit a friend, and there she was, gliding through the halls with that perfect smile, her hands clasped in front of her like a saint in a stained glass window. At first I thought it was just me being paranoid after Michael Trent. I told myself to let it go. But then I started hearing things. What kind of things? The detective asks, his voice flat. Whispers, I say, my eyes narrowing at the memory. Not from her patients, not from the nurses. It came from her. Whenever she passed by, I could hear them, faint and distant like voices carried on a breeze. They didn't make sense at first, just fragments of words, but they weren't in any language I knew. The detective doesn't interrupt, but I can see his skepticism growing. I started watching her, I continue. At work, at home, at the hospice. The first thing I noticed was that her patients always seemed to get worse after she arrived. People who were stable would suddenly crash, their vitals plummeting for no apparent reason. And the deaths? What about them? They were too clean, too perfect. No complications, no struggles. It was like she knew exactly how to make it look natural. But when I checked their charts, when I dug deeper, I found something else. Every single one of her patients had been listed as organ donors, and every single one of their organs had been harvested. That's not unusual, the detective points out. Not when the organs go to people on a transplant list, I counter, but these didn't. They disappeared. No record, no trail, just gone. And then there were the missing children. His pen freezes mid-scratch. Rebecca had a habit of visiting the pediatric ward during her shifts, I explain. Always bringing them toys, reading them stories. But if you look at the hospital's records, you'll find that in the 3 years she worked there, 7 children went missing. No explanations, no investigations that went anywhere. And do you know what every single one of those kids had in common? The detective shakes his head. They were all terminal, I say. Every one of them. No family to claim them. No one to ask questions. Just gone. And you think Rebecca was behind it? I know she was, I say firmly. I followed her one night after her shift. She didn't go home. She went to the hospice, but not to work. She parked behind the building in the alley where the cameras don't reach. And she wasn't alone. There was a man waiting for her. Tall, dressed in black, with a face I couldn't see no matter how hard I tried. They talked for a while and then she handed him something, a bag. It was small, like it could have fit a loaf of bread, but the way he took it, the way he cradled it, I knew it wasn't bread. The detective's lips tighten, but he doesn't speak. I confronted her the next day, outside the hospice, I continue. I asked her where the kids were. She just laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a fake one. The same kind of laugh Michael Trent gave me, deep, hollow. And then she looked at me, and her eyes... I trail off, the memory vivid in my mind. They weren't black like his. They were yellow, like an animal's. And when she smiled, I saw her teeth, long and sharp like fangs. She didn't even try to deny it. She just said, "You shouldn't have followed me." And then she lunged. "And you killed her?" "I had to," I say, my voice steady. She was faster than Trent, stronger too. I barely got away. I managed to grab a scalpel from her bag and stabbed her in the neck. She bled, but it wasn't blood. It was thick, black like tar. She screamed, and then she burned just like Trent did. Nothing left but ash. The detective stares at me, his face a mask of disbelief. "2 people turn to ash after you kill them, and you expect me to believe this?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," I reply. "But there's more. Derek Holder. You'll believe me after him." The detective exhales heavily, tapping his pen against the table as if he's trying to decide whether to keep humouring me or walk out of the room entirely. He glances at the camera in the corner, then back at me. "All right," he says, his voice laced with exhaustion. "Derek Holder. What's his story?" "Derek wasn't like Michael or Rebecca," I begin, my voice dropping slightly. "He didn't bother hiding what he was. He didn't need to. He thrived on chaos, on fear, and people let him get away with it because they thought he was untouchable." "What was he?" "A preacher," I say, the word dripping with disdain. "The kind that builds empires out of other people's pain. Derek was the founder of a megachurch. The Light of Salvation, he called it. His followers worshipped him like he was the second coming, and he loved every second of it. I first heard about him on the news. They were running a story about his outreach programs, feeding the homeless, funding orphanages, sending aid overseas. He was everywhere, shaking hands with politicians, holding press conferences, always smiling for the cameras. But even through the screen I could feel it. That same crawling sensation, like something inside me recoiled just looking at him. The detective raises an eyebrow. "So you went after him because you didn't like his face?" "No," I say sharply. "I went after him because I started digging. At first I couldn't find anything. His records were clean, too clean. But then I started talking to people, the ones he'd supposedly helped. A lot of them didn't want to talk. And the ones who did..." I paused, shaking my head. "They were terrified. They told me stories about how Derek's outreach programs weren't about charity. They were about control. The homeless he brought into his shelters, half of them disappeared. The orphanages he funded, run like prisons, and the aid he sent overseas, it never made it to the people who needed it. It vanished, just like the rest of his victims. The detective scribbles something in his notebook, his expression unreadable. "And you have proof of this?" "I didn't need proof," I say. "I saw it with my own eyes. I went to one of his services just to see him in person. The moment he stepped onto that stage, I knew. The way the crowd reacted to him, it wasn't normal. They weren't just excited, they were entranced, like they couldn't look away. And Derek, he fed off it, literally." The detective frowns. "What do you mean, literally?" "I mean, I saw the energy draining out of those people and into him. Their faces went pale, their eyes dim, but they didn't even notice. They just kept clapping, kept singing, kept praising him like he was God. And then he looked at me. He knew I didn't belong there. He smiled, and I swear, for a second I saw something moving under his skin, like his body was just a suit, and whatever was inside it was shifting." The detective leans back, his skepticism practically radiating off him. "So, you killed him too?" "Not right away," I admit. "I needed to know more. I followed him after the service back to his estate. The place was massive, gates, cameras, security everywhere. But I got in, and what I found—" I trail off, my stomach turning at the memory. "What did you find?" "A chapel," I say, my voice cold, "but not the kind you'd expect. It was underground, hidden beneath his mansion. The walls were covered in symbols. Pentagrams, runes, things I didn't understand. And in the centre of the room was an altar. It was black, smooth as glass, with grooves carved into it. Grooves that channeled blood. There were pictures too, dozens of them, pinned to the walls, all of his followers, all of them with the same hollow look in their eyes, and then there were the bones." The detective stiffens. "Bones?" "Children's bones," I say flatly. "Piles of them, scattered like trash. Some of them still had scraps of clothing. They were sacrifices. That's what his outreach was funding, rituals to feed whatever it was living inside him." The detective shakes his head, his expression a mix of disgust and disbelief. "You're telling me this man murdered children, ran a death cult, and no one noticed?" "No one wanted to notice," I say. "He was too powerful, too untouchable. But I noticed, and I stopped him." "How?" "I waited until he was alone in that chapel. He didn't even try to hide what he was when he saw me. His skin, it started peeling back like it couldn't contain whatever was underneath. His voice changed too, deep, guttural, like it wasn't meant for human ears. He came at me faster than anything I'd ever seen. I barely had time to pull the knife I'd brought, but when I stabbed him, he laughed. He pulled it out like it was nothing. That's when I realized he wasn't like the others. But I had something else, a vial of holy water I'd taken from the church above. I smashed it against his chest, and he screamed, his body smoking like acid was eating through it. I kept stabbing him again and again until he collapsed, and then he burned just like the rest of them." The detective stares at me, his pen hovering over the page. "You realize how insane this sounds, right?" I smile faintly. "I do, but you'll believe me soon enough." "Why's that?" "Because the worst one is still out there," I say, leaning forward. "And that's why I'm here, to finish what I started." The air in the room thickens as I lean back in my chair, watching the detective's pen freeze mid-word. For the first time since I started talking, he looks genuinely unsettled. Good. He should be. "You're here to finish what you started," Ross repeats, his voice carefully neutral. "What exactly does that mean?" I let the silence hang between us for a moment before answering. "You're the last one, Ross. You're why I turned myself in." His jaw tightens, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a smirk if it wasn't so tense. That's quite the accusation. "It's not an accusation," I say calmly. "It's a fact. I knew the moment I walked into this room, the way the lights flickered when you came in, the way the temperature dropped, the way your shadow doesn't quite match your movements." Ross's eyes narrow. "You're insane. Maybe, I admit, tilting my head, but I'm not wrong. He leans forward, his elbows resting on the table. His voice drops, low and almost mocking. All right. Enlighten me. What exactly do you think I am? You're not human, I reply. Not anymore. You've been wearing that skin for so long, I doubt you even remember what you were before, but I know what you are now. You're a parasite, a predator. You've been hiding in plain sight, feeding off the worst humanity has to offer. And what better place to do that than here, a police station? You don't have to go looking for evil. It comes to you. Ross chuckles, but there's no humour in it. That's some imagination you've got. You should have been a writer instead of a killer. You're good, I say, ignoring his jab. I'll give you that. You've played the part perfectly, the overworked detective. The righteous crusader for justice, but it's just a mask, isn't it? Just like the others. His smile fades, and for the first time, I see it, the tiniest crack in his facade. Think about it, I press. All the cases you've closed, the criminals you've taken down, the ones who ended up dead before they could stand trial. The ones who disappeared. You didn't bring them to justice, Ross. You devoured them. You absorbed their darkness, their sins. That's how you've stayed hidden for so long. His hands are still on the table, but his fingers curl slightly like claws itching to tear through flesh. I've been watching you, I continue. Even before I turn myself in, I've seen the way you look at people, like you're peeling them apart in your mind. I've seen the way they look at you, how they flinch when you're near. They can't explain it, but I can. They feel it, the wrongness. Ross tilts his head, his expression cold and unreadable. And what's your plan exactly? You think you're going to kill me? Here, in a police station, surrounded by armed officers and cameras? I don't think, I say, my voice steady. I know. The lights flicker again, this time more violently. The temperature in the room plummets, my breath visible in the cold air. Ross doesn't move, but his shadow stretches across the floor, growing, twisting until it seems to take on a life of its own. You're clever, he says, his voice no longer entirely human. It's layered, deeper, reverberating like a low growl. I'll give you that, but you're not the first to come after me, and you won't be the last. Maybe not, I admit, pulling a small worn cross from my pocket. But I'll be the one who finishes this. Ross snarls, his teeth sharpening into points, his eyes glowing faintly red. His shadow rises like smoke, swirling around him, taking on the shape of something far larger, far more monstrous than the man sitting across from me. I lunge. The room is in shambles. The table lies overturned, the walls scorched with claw marks and streaks of black ichor. Ross's body, or what's left of it, lies crumpled in the corner, dissolving into ash. I sit on the floor, my chest heaving, blood dripping from a gash on my arm. The cross is still clutched in my hand, its edges glowing faintly with heat. The door bursts open and 2 officers rush in, their guns drawn. They freeze when they see the room, their eyes wide with horror. "What the hell happened in here?" one of them demands. I look up at them, my face calm despite the chaos. "Justice," I say simply. They don't understand, they won't. But it doesn't matter, my work is done. I let them cuff me, let them drag me out of the room. Let them believe I'm just a man, a murderer confessing to crimes no one will ever truly comprehend. Because I know the truth. And now, so do you.